As the 2023 finance bill undergoes reworking by the National Assembly, reactions have continued to trail key reforms to tax laws and other relevant laws proposed in the legislation, according to concerns raised by critical stakeholders, notably the Center for the Promotion of Private Enterprises. The imposition of excise duty on all services will affect the business community negatively. The center also noted businesses are currently burdened with over 50 taxes, levies, and fees, both legally and illegally. Maintaining that these numerous taxes and levies, aside constituting a disincentive to business, might in the end be a recipe for disinvestment and are made a volatile operating environment, riddled with high cost of production and unable unabating inflationary pressure. It will interest you to know that President Muhammadu Buhari, while signing the 2023 budget into law, just to return the Finance Bill 2022 as passed by the National Assembly for their reconsideration as part of his administration's appreciation of the depth of the misgivings and out of the difference to the concerns raised by the private sector. Well, let's talk more about this and other burning issues. I'm being joined live in our Lagos studio. He's an economist. He's also a tax manager. He's with PricewaterhouseCoopers, Mr. Abiodun Kayode-Alli. Thank you so much. It's good to have you in the studio.
Thank you for having me today.
Well, it's a new year. I know we've spoken, but Happy New Year again.
I wish you the same compliments.
And all the best. I wish a profitable year, let me say it that way.
Thank you.
Well, let's get talking today. Well, let's start with inflation. That's the biggest one we have now. A little bit of decrease. Some will say, are we going to continue with this trend? Or what, in your thoughts, do you think is really responsible for this slight reduction that we've seen, despite the buy-ins and all of that during the festive season?
Well, okay, so it's a marginal decline, really. 21.47,
not very significant.
Not too significant, really. Right. So I think some of the reasons that were given by the National Bureau of Statistics, some of them had to do with the strengthening of the naira during that period. You know, a lot of our inflation has to do with it's caused by importation, right? Import-induced inflation. So the naira actually strengthened in that period, and you can even allude to the fact that a lot of Nigerians who are in the diaspora, they actually came back home, right, to enjoy the festive seasons with their relatives, right, compared to the cold winter that they had there. So they could easily enjoy our sun here in this part of the world. So they had to bring in their FX. So that, to some extent, helped in the strengthening of the naira. Then also, there were concerns that some of the prices, right, kind of dissuaded consumers from actually making purchases, right? So there are some reasons that are being given that says that, okay, some producers or some sellers had to bring down their price a bit, right? But I don't think it's pretty much a significant decline from my point of view. Costs were still high, right? 21% is still high by any standard you want to look at it, regardless of whether it's a few percentage drop. And I think one thing we should also realize is that despite the fact that on a year-on-year basis there was a decline, on a month-on-month basis that wasn't the case, right? So there was an increase on a month-on-month basis, and the factors that were responsible for them, right? You can still look at it. The festive season on its own was still responsible for that. Then the flooding as well, which affected a lot of regions, right? Especially the food basket of the nation. Then you also want to look at, to some extent, the currency, the FX rates, right? The exchange rate is still high, right? Despite the fact that there was that strengthening. I mean, if you want to compare it to 2021 ending, it was somewhere within the range of 500, right? But in 2022, we had it at 700. So those are still high numbers that we're seeing here. And if you consider the average man on the street, does this figure mean anything to him? I would think not. I don't think so, right? Food prices are still on the increase. Their wages are not giving them what they want to consume. Like I said the last time, the minimum wage which the president has signed is competing with a bag of rice. In fact, a bag of rice is even more expensive than the 30,000 minimum wage. So yes, we can brandy the figure, and policymakers can be happy a little concerning that marginal decline. But I don't think it's significant enough to move the needle from my perspective.
This is Abiodun being very blunt here, but that's the truth. I totally agree with you. Let's also look at the sharp increases we've seen in energy costs, transportation costs. You've talked about exchange rates. How does all of this impact this figures from the MBS?
Well, it's interesting that despite the fact that
Price
globally,
of fuel too.
Exactly, I was going to come to that. Despite the fact that crude oil prices kind of went down towards the end of the year, right? It didn't translate to a drop in price at which we buy the PMS, right, from the pump, right? It didn't translate to that. And part of the reason is because we're still import dependent, right? Even though we sell our crude oil, there is even that issue of we not getting enough revenue, even when the price was high. Even though we sell the crude oil, right, we still have to pay for the subsidy, right? And in trying to subsidize the cost, even the landing cost, right, was so significant that a lot of independent oil marketers, you could see them changing the prices, fixing different prices, right? Some getting it at 170, the common ones, NNPC, right? While others were selling at the range of 250 naira per liter, right? And this cost, actually, you could see it translate in the products, items that were being sold. Because if you think about it, diesel is deregulated, right? Most of the food items that you are purchasing, right, the trucks, the vehicles that bring them, mobilize them, they're running on diesel, right? And apart from that, even businesses, services had to increase their price a little. And if you even consider the impact of the fuel scarcity, the shortage, right, it's led to increase in transport costs on its own, right? So all these things actually fed into that inflation that we have, right? So these are some of the things that need to be tackled if you want to see prices come down. And I think one key thing, one of the structural things which is actually responsible for increase in food prices especially, has to do with security, right? It's something that is worrisome. Security is something that if you can deal with it to a significant extent, it's not every time they are going to have that impact of flooding. It's not every time. There will be some, though we should tackle that, but there will be some couple of years, right? But one key significant thing that we need to deal with is security. As long as that is being taken care of, it will be so easy for farmers to go to their farms, plant their crops, and send it across to different regions. Then I think one other key thing has to do with infrastructure, transport infrastructure, which was also in fact impacted by the flooding, all right? So once you're able to deal with all these things, you would see a decline in prices, right, to a reasonable extent. And if you can deal with our consumption appetite for foreign things to a reasonable extent, you will see significant changes.
Honestly, that runs through my mind sometimes. You know, when I look at it, I can see your suit now. This is a designer suit, and of course, it wasn't made in Nigeria. You know, but really, I think there needs to be an attitudinal change on, you know, we need to just change our mindset about that if we are to conserve this effects that we have as a country. And that pushes me to my next question, which is around the Finance Act, which is supposed to support the budget for government to get more revenue at this time. We know that government needs revenue, and they're looking at the non-oil space. But we've seen a lot of analysts picking holes in this document this time around, and the president is not even putting pen to paper and saying, we need to look at this again. In your thoughts, you've seen that document, what it was before now. What is your take, considering some of the increases and changes that we see? It looks like government is becoming, maybe aggressive is the word, in raising money.
Well, the honest truth is, if you look at what most countries in the world have gone through, right from 2020, in fact, it's like this decade is going to be a very interesting one, right from 2020.
So they might not be wrong to be that aggressive.
Well, to some extent, yes, to some extent, yeah, because most nations of the world, especially developing economies, they are significantly looking for revenues, right? The war in Europe hasn't helped their circumstances at all, right? And considering that most of these nations actually spent a lot during the pandemic, right, came up with different plans, and their expenses are high, their debts are high, right? You can see that currently having a 44 trillion public debt that we have in Nigeria, right, which is, they're saying, is likely to increase to 77 trillion by May. Right, so a lot of these nations actually spent a lot. So there is quite a need for them to try and shore up that revenue, right? And that's what you can see in the Finance Act, about 5 policy objectives, right? And one of them has to do with revenue generation. So yes, there are some aspects of it that that are good. There is the good side, so it's not like I'm totally condemning the document, but there are some aspects that are kind of aggressive, right? That are kind of aggressive.
I like that word.
Yeah, and there is this aspect, and I think it's even this particular aspect that is probably causing the president to withhold his assent, right? Because if you look at it from the petroleum side, most of the changes that were made to the Petroleum Profit Tax Act to the petroleum industry side, right? They seem to be a bit punitive, right? They seem to be a bit punitive. For every act of non-compliance, the penalties are huge, right? So it would make anyone who is operating in that sector think twice before they find themselves not complying with the laws, right? But to now look at other aspects of it, such as the increase in the tax rate, the tertiary education tax. It was just last year that we had it increase from 2% to 2.5. Now we're moving it to 3%, right? There is that aspect. Then there is also the aspect that has to do with climate change, right? Green economy, whereby if you find a gas flaring company, the tax rate now becomes 50%, right? So in my own perspective, if you look at something like the tertiary education tax, these are taxes that are being borne by compliant companies, right? Companies that are compliant. So the question you then ask yourself is, aren't you overburdening these compliant companies with so much taxes, right? So I think one thing that might be important is that, like it's also said in that policy document, diversify that base, right? Diversify the base, the tax base, such that you bring in more people into the tax net rather than keep increasing the rate of taxes. And one thing that affects compliance, willingness to comply, has to do with how efficiently you are utilizing those resources. And if you think about it, most of these companies, they are companies that still remained in business despite the tough challenges, the economic challenges, the headwinds that we faced 2021, 2022, right? They are employing people. So these companies are actually doing a lot of good to the economy. One thing they've always complained about is an enabling environment, right? Infrastructure that can help promote their business. They survived 2022 when energy prices were up the roof, right? They survived. They still kept some people. Now you're raising taxes at this point in time. So these are some of their concerns that they have right now. And apart from that, there are some incentives. Part of the policy objective has to do with reworking those incentives such that the ones that are redundant can be taken away and giving more new incentives to individuals in terms of personal income tax and also companies that want to invest in the gas space, which is quite good. Right, but out of the incentives they are taking away, I do agree that some of them might be a bit, was not too impactful, like the rural investment incentive, investment allowance. There was this rural investment allowance that was given to companies that would carry out investments in facilities not less than 20 kilometers from where they were located. And some of the conditions that were in that particular incentive were stringent. It was difficult to meet it, to be honest. So if you are taking it out, that makes sense. But from my own standpoint, I would think Nigeria has a huge infrastructural gap deficit. We have that, right? Why not rework that incentive in such a way that you are encouraging companies to set up branches, plants, facilities in these rural areas? Let them develop most of these areas, because the honest truth, like we know, government on its own can't cater to the needs of people in terms of infrastructure. You need to work hand in hand with the private sector. So reworking some of these incentives will be good, right? Then the investment allowance, government said we can't afford it any longer. That's why they are taking the investment allowance, right? Because, this incentive they are giving, it's more like foregone revenue to them, right? So to some extent, I think it will impact a lot of businesses, right? Because a lot of businesses were using it to reduce their tax payable. That's number one. And apart from that, investors with foreign direct investments who wanted to come and invest in the Nigerian environment, would they be encouraged if you see that you have taken out this thing that they were looking forward to 10%, right? So these are some of the concerns I have. Then I think one key concern, which most analysts have spoken about, has to do with the speed at which it was introduced and it was passed. I mean, calling stakeholder meeting on the 21st, 22nd, you've already passed it to the next stage. I mean, so that speed, right, not having enough stakeholder to come together as we used to have in the past, whereby people would come, share their thoughts as it is expected, right, because it's a democracy, right? Government sometimes needs the ideas and needs the suggestions of stakeholders,
Yes.
right? So these were things that were missing, right? So I think to some reasonable extent, it's quite good that the president actually withheld his assent, right? Sent it back to the MDAs, look at this thing. Do you think it's good? It's good for passing. So I think if we go through this process whereby people can give in their own thoughts and their own inputs, I think it will end up bringing a more productive finance bill compared to what is currently there. Those are my few thoughts on it.
Well, intelligent stuff there, and really touching on almost all aspects of that document. Well, let's go to the budget itself, almost wrapping up the segment of the conversation. The assumptions, before we talk about deficit, which everyone has talked about the deficit and how scary it looks. But let's look at the assumptions now for me. Some say 1.6 million barrels per day looks too ambitious for us. We're still doing about 1.2 and all of that, even including condensate and all of that. So that's on one side. Then the FX thing, that big elephant in the cupboard. It's about 435 naira. Where is it? So some say no. How realistic is this document? So what do you think? How conservative, or what do you make of the assumptions of this document?
Oh, those assumptions, very interesting. I think when it comes to planning, we're always too optimistic, right? But then reality hits us at one point in time. You know, before I go into the assumptions, let me take you to the 2022 budget performance, right? On the 4th of January, that was just 2 weeks ago, Wednesday, when the finance minister was talking about the performance. You would see there that when it came to most of the expenditures, we were overperforming when it came to the expenditures. When it came to the revenue, there was a lot of
issues,
right?
there.
Yeah. So I looked at the aggregate expenditure. By the time you prorate it from January to November, because those were the figures that were available, right? You would see that the actual budget, that was the actual performance, right? It was quite a lot, right? We overspent, right, compared to what we have budgeted for in terms of aggregate expenditure. In terms of recurrent expenditure, we had overspent. In terms of debt service, we had overspent by 75% in terms of debt service. So if you look at all these things, they were coming on the backdrop of the assumptions we had, right? So it's quite important that whenever we make these assumptions, we try to be realistic, right? So in my own view, the 2023 assumptions, like you rightly pointed out, to me, I think they're too optimistic, right? They're too optimistic. It's 1.69 million barrels per day. Right? Not that we don't have the capacity. There were points in time.
They will do 1.8 before the elections, and they say they can even do 2.4.
We do have the capacity. We've been doing 2.1 million barrels per day, sometime in 2015. But if you look at the entire 2022, average production was barely 1 million barrels per day. It was barely. We're having that. It was up until I think November that we started hitting 1.2 million barrels per day. So I think 1.69, as long as you've not dealt with those critical issues of infrastructure, right, of security as well, right, because it was just in January that some small oil barges were discovered, right, with people illegally transporting crude oil, right. So as long as if you don't deal with all these things, right, those assumptions, I have issues with them, honestly. I do have issues with them because right now it seems like government is actually more focused on the election at this point in time. So
it's always like that most times.
For now till the elections are over, they are well, I don't want to say they are barely putting their mind into this, right? So I think it's overly optimistic. Then if you also look at some of the revenue projections as well, which is also based on the output, right? If you look at some of those revenue projections, I also have issues with them. 10 trillion naira, that's the revenue that is expected, right? So if you look at, we did 6.5 last year with the projected, the estimated revenue somewhere around, I think, 7.9 trillion. We did 6.5. So we've always not met that revenue. So it means that the only way we would be looking at financing that budget would actually come to borrowing. And we currently have an existing debt stock that is high. Our debt servicing has been significantly high. So I think those assumptions really, I think they are too optimistic. Inflation at 17% when we're talking about 21% here. So I think So optimistic.
We've had reviews of growth projections, figures from everywhere. IMF, the World Bank. Even last week, the World Economic Forum had something to say about Nigeria. But in all of this, I know PwC works on all of these reports, but just generally, what is your outlook? Yes, we know it's an election year. Yes, we expect a transition, and all of that. But if all of the scenarios, what do you think it will be the outlook?
Well, I think it depends, and I will say it depends. If the war still continues, right? The war is definitely going to impact the whole world, right? And there are concerns about climate change, right? So if we consider all these externalities to a reasonable extent, it will impact on our growth. Right, the 3.75%, and it appears that out of everyone who gave predictions, it appears the federal government seems to be still the most optimistic of all of them. It's 3.75% growth rate.
Well, I don't blame them.
Right. So in my own view, right, I do think that if Nigeria continues the way it is, right, there will still be growth, no doubt, but it could be better. But the expectation is that growth rates should actually be higher than population growth rates, which is what is key. Because all these parameters that we're reeling out, the most important thing is how does it affect the common man. So it's simply the impact, right? The trickle-down effects. It's developments we care about. So because all these figures, we could be reeling them out, but how does it affect the common man on the street? So in my own opinion, I think Nigeria has a lot to do. If we actually take out that subsidy, inflation will, I expect prices will go up. I expect, right, in the short to medium term, I expect prices will go up. But it then depends on how quick or what are the plans that government has in place to redirect those amounts. Subsidy in its own is quite huge. What are the plans the government has to redirect those amounts in such a way that it's able to cater for the vulnerable in our midst? So those are the things I'm looking at. I think to some extent, things if we don't bite the bullet, if we don't take the unusual policies, as the World Bank has always advised us, I think to a reasonable extent we'll find out that we're talking about a high multidimensional poverty beyond the 133 million that the MBS reeled out sometime in November, right? I think to a reasonable extent we need to take some hard steps, very hard steps, deal with an enabling business environment, deal with that, because that is going to impact on production. Really, if you are able to tackle issues like security, if you're able to prevent the massive brain drain that we're seeing with the Japa syndrome, a lot of people going, especially the young working class people, if you're able to tackle things like that, if you're able to tackle inflation, which is still comes down to security, comes down to dealing with issues regarding farming, probably providing a more advanced method of farming to in the country, really. If you're able to tackle all these issues and deal with, to a reasonable extent, even our crude oil output, we know that Nigeria is trying to diversify its revenue base, right, from depending on crude oil as its major source of forex. If you're able to deal with diversifying, and also if you're able to deal with our output, our oil output, to a reasonable extent, we will be able to increase our reserves, right? And that will, to a reasonable extent, help buffer the current exchange rate that we're seeing. So if we're able to tackle all these issues, I do think that Nigeria could probably achieve that 3.75%.
I must thank you so much for your time. Abiodun Kayode-Alli is an economist and tax manager with PricewaterhouseCoopers. Thank you so much for your contribution and support on the show. We don't take this for granted. We appreciate your time.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
All right.